All right, we are live streaming. I'm still bringing some people into the meeting. Hold on. Still missing Marcus and Steve. All right, Marcus is joining us.
Hey, Sean, are those, which screen of COVID is behind you? Should you like label each one of them different?
Sadly, there aren't enough to cover all of the different variants that exist.
Okay.
Do you feel bad you brought it up now?
No, I don't.
It's all about the vaccine. It's all about vaccines right now.
Has anybody heard from Councilmember Ewing? No?
We had Marcus.
Yeah, looks like he dropped off. Councilmember Ewing, if you are the 109372, can you call me? Let me know that's you so I can let you in. Here comes Marcus.
Well, it is 6:01, so let's get started on this. This is going to be a Lake Stevens City Council workshop meeting tonight, and this will be held via Zoom. It is Tuesday, February 16th, 2021, and it is 6 p.m. We've got a very short, just 2 items on the agenda tonight, and then I have a couple of just housekeeping items afterwards. So it looks like a short meeting tonight. So with that, David, you are up. Amendments to SEPA exemptions for minor new construction and infill development.
All right, thank you, Mayor Gailey. Council members, David Levitan, Senior Planner. So we are here tonight to talk about potential amendments to the city's SEPA exemption thresholds. Basically, state law allows for cities, historically, we're given a number of minor new construction thresholds for single-family residential development, multifamily residential development, and then different types of commercial development. In 2012, the state gave cities the option of adopting flexible exemption thresholds above the standard thresholds. Basically, can adopt thresholds anywhere between the standard thresholds and the maximums established by the state. So the city has been looking at doing this for the last few years, and we've decided to move forward at this point with proposed amendments to that. I'm going to go ahead and share my screen just to show a quick table of the potential amendments. And I had just a little bit of an overview on the process. So we've held work sessions with the Planning Commission, held 3 work sessions with the Planning Commission to discuss potential amendments to the minor new construction thresholds, which are shown on the next slide. Basically, based on the feedback from the Planning Commission, they felt that we should up the thresholds above where they are now, but not bring them all the way up to the maximums. So as shown on the next slide, we looked at some neighboring cities, including the city of Everett, Marysville, Snohomish County, as well as Arlington and Monroe. And in the cases of Everett, Marysville, Snohomish, and the county, they raised them up to the maximum thresholds. So looking at this, that left column, the standard, which is the existing, that's our current minor new construction thresholds, basically allows for up to 4 units of either single family or multifamily residential development, 10,000 square feet of agricultural buildings, up to a 4,000 square foot kind of non-agricultural commercial building, including schools, up to 20 parking spaces and 100 cubic yards. That middle column is the maximum, so it would be a pretty big jump up, especially on the residential side of things, going up to the potential for 30 units of single family residential development that would be exempt from SEPA environmental review, and 60 units for multifamily. And then some relatively large commercial developments as well, and up to 90 parking spaces without having to go through the SEPA review process. And basically what the Planning Commission ended up recommending based on the proposal from staff was to kind of basically meet sort of in the middle. Felt that subdivisions up to basically 9 units, multifamily residential developments up to 20 units, kind of both agricultural and commercial buildings up to 20,000 square feet, and then up to 40 parking spaces, and then also potentially up to 500 cubic yards of grading, cut and fill, which would be about half as much as it is allowed by the maximum thresholds. They felt that that was most appropriate for the city of Lake Stevens. And so we did want to get a little bit of feedback on that. And just moving backwards just slightly, one of the main requirements to raise, for a city to raise its minor new construction thresholds is to demonstrate that there are adequate environmental regulations in place for things such as critical areas and stormwater management, traffic management, that there are adequate regulations at the local, state, and federal levels to basically show that the SEPA process is essentially redundant, that there are those adequate regulations in place that would justify exemption from the SEPA environmental review process. And so that was was the recommendation from the Planning Commission. We also discussed the potential for a SEPA infill exemption ordinance. So this would be in addition to the updates to the city's minor new construction thresholds. This basically allows cities to establish via separate ordinance certain levels of infill development in specific areas of the city where it feels like that SEPA environmental review should not be required for infill development. It allows for basically cities to establish their standards for mixed use and residential development, and allows for up to 65,000 square feet of commercial development, not including not including retail. And so this would basically allow the city to allow larger projects to be exempt from SEPA environmental review. We discussed this with the Planning Commission, and their recommendation after looking into this and hearing from staff in a couple of those work sessions was that the city not move forward with an infill exemption ordinance at this point. They felt that increasing the minor new construction threshold throughout the city, when coupled with the planned action ordinances for some of our sub areas, the downtown Lake Stevens sub area, the 20th Street corridor, and the Lake Stevens Center sub area. Basically, the planned action ordinances that were adopted by the City Council back in 2012 and 2018 basically allowed for a certain amount of development within those sub areas to be exempt from the SEPA environmental review process. We haven't reached any of the maximum thresholds. Basically, the city shifted the environmental review to the planning stage and established maximum values for how much residential and non-residential development could occur within those sub areas. And we haven't hit any of the maximum caps on that development yet. And so the Planning Commission felt that really the SEPA infill exemption ordinance wouldn't be needed at this time, that they couldn't really think of an area that would need to go up to 65,000 square feet of commercial development or allow for exemptions for residential development that exceeded the standard minor new construction thresholds that the city is proposing. So kind of the feedback that we're looking to get from the city council tonight is basically, does the council agree with the Planning Commission's recommendation to increase the minor construction thresholds to those values that were shown on the table, in the previous slide? And the second recommendation was to not adopt an infill ordinance. Are there alternative minor new construction thresholds that council feels would be more appropriate for Lake Stevens, either lower or higher? And then looking at next steps, once we have this input from council, we're going to start the process to amend the code and go through the required process from the Department of Ecology, providing all the required notice to state agencies, tribes, and the public to make sure that we comply with all the requirements for amending our SEPA thresholds.
Excuse me,
so-
David, hold on.
Yeah,
Kelly, could you please let Marcus back in?
Absolutely. Hold on.
Thank you, David.
yeah, no problem.
Sorry about that.
And so, yeah, I'll wait for Councilmember Tadgett back in?
Yes, I'm back in. I've been able to listen the whole time, so.
Okay, great. So yeah, what we're looking for feedback from the council is on those two items. If they agree with the proposed increases to the minor new construction thresholds, and they agree with the Planning Commission's recommendation to not adopt a infill exemption ordinance for specific areas of the city. And I'll go ahead and go back just as a reminder. This right column is what the Planning Commission is recommending, and then the center column is what the maximum allowed through the flexible threshold program through the state. So I'm happy to answer any question.
David, before we jump into questions, I wanted to provide a little bit of feedback for some of the newer council members that have never dealt with the State Environmental Policy Act. So as
Okay.
part of local project review, there are several phases. One of the first phases that mid to large projects go through is this environmental review. The city looks at things like, what are the impacts on water? What are the impacts on earth? Impacts on aesthetics? There's a variety of criteria on a checklist that the applicant has to fill out and the city has to review for compliance. And that's where we get into this other table where we compare to existing regulations. Do we have other regulations that cover these same things to really identify the impact? So with development, as I said, this comes in at the beginning and there's a timeline associated with it and its own appeal path. So that starts at the beginning of the project, and it is one of the major points of citizen interaction with development permits. And as we make these changes, some of the recommendations, at least as far as staff looked at it and spoke with the Planning Commission, also is what other opportunities outside of a SEPA process is there then for public comment, and how do those overlap? So anyway, I just wanted to provide a little feedback to some newer council members that this is one of the steps that most new developments go through based on state law, and then how you implement it can have a little bit of changes with your local code. And it is one of the main focal points for community engagement. So with that, I'll hand it back over to David.
All right. Well, thanks, Russ. Yeah, so I'm done with my presentation, and I appreciate the context and the background on that. Sometimes I forget that not everyone's as steeped in these things as we are as planners. So I appreciate that additional context to this discussion. So with that, I would open it up. I can go ahead and stop sharing the screen, or I can leave it up there if council members would like to have the proposed amended levels there on the screen, or I can go ahead and stop sharing the screen.
I have a question, if I may speak. You can hear me, right?
I can.
Okay. First of all, I want this well-written presentation that this retired teacher is amazingly able to understand is no small feat. Thank you so much. Secondly, the Planning Commission continues to put careful consideration into the issues as always. I fully trust our Planning Commission. But for the purpose of transparency, I have one question. Can you give me an example of one thing that could happen now with these revisions in place that could not happen unless we allow this to occur? Can you think of anything that?
Well, so for example, if an 8-unit subdivision came in now, they would be required for single family residential development, they would be required to go through the SEPA environmental review process. If that was raised up to 9 units, they would not be required to go through SEPA. They would still be subject to all of our local regulations and all of the state and federal regulations related to things like critical areas and stormwater management, but they would not be required to go through that SEPA review.
Okay. Is this tied in any way to the task force that we had that was looking at anything on the lake, properties on the lake?
No, so the task force was focused on expanding permitted residential development, the types of residential development that would be allowed. And so that was kind of more of a land use issue as opposed to an environmental regulation issue.
Okay, thank you. That's it.
I have a quick question. Thank you for the information and presentation, David. You had mentioned that one of the motivations for the state allowing this flexibility is to decrease redundancy. Are you aware of any other motivations why the state is allowing cities this type of flexibility at this point?
I would see maybe if Russ has some additional info. I was basically just moving to Oregon when they were adopting the flexible thresholds, and so I didn't really get totally involved in the process. And so that was the main issue, was just, especially for on the residential side of things, you know, a 4-unit multifamily residential development, when you're dealing with one site in a large building that's still subject to all the stormwater regulations, that has to do a traffic study, that's subject to critical areas regulations, was that essentially the SEPA checklist became just basically something you had to do without, you know, it typically didn't generate a whole lot of controversy for projects on the smaller to medium side of things. And so the state kind of thought through what appropriate levels of development would be to be exempt from that environmental review process. I don't know if Russ has any additional context on that.
I think that, yeah, that was for the changes in the flexible thresholds. That's absolutely correct. It's just, SEPA was a great tool when it was started in the 70s. Since SEPA, we've had updates to the Shoreline Management Act, updates, you know, we've had the implementation of the Growth Management Act and increased critical areas regulation. So as new regulations appear, SEPA becomes less relevant in a lot of cases. But maintaining SEPA, though, also gives jurisdictions what's called, I forgot the terminology that I wanted to use, but it gives a substantive authority to make conditions on certain projects that otherwise might not get made. If there are things, say, outside of our traffic mitigation code, and a project comes in and we still know that there's a local impact, even though it's not in our capital facilities plan, SEPA gives us the authority to require that improvement to make sure an intersection is safe or something like that, if it's getting contributions from this new development. So it is a safe check valve. In 9 out of 10 cases, though, our regulations, our local regulations for small to mid-sized projects are going to be covered under the local, state, or federal regulations that we already imply. Moving on to this secondary step that we're talking about for these infill incentives, they go to extremely large thresholds, and these were really geared more towards larger cities, that this would be completely either redevelopment. It's really geared towards large scale redevelopment of entire blocks. And that really gets to, and the commercial component is for obviously economic development reasons. The housing element, that is for affordability. So again, that's more of a tool to look at redevelopment in large, totally built out cities. And that's where we're sort of in the middle, that we've not quite reached the existing density that it necessarily makes sense when the city's taken proactive steps through its planned action to already streamline SEPA process. Did that make sense or make it more confusing?
No, that made really, really great sense. Super helpful. Thanks.
Yeah, and as Councilmember Dickinson had pointed out, the Planning Commission was very, as they typically are, was very deliberate in their consideration of the proposed thresholds. We gave them some examples of, if we were to raise it to that maximum flexible thresholds there in the middle, a 60-unit multifamily residential development is something much different than, a 20 or a 30 unit. That's a pretty large development. And so they felt that it was more appropriate to have it, after several discussions, to have it at that 20 units, which would allow for kind of some moderate to medium-sized projects, but not getting to those types of projects that Russ was describing.
David, if I may, I have a few questions on this. And I guess you kind of elaborated a little bit. The Planning Commission was careful in their deliberations as to how they arrived on 9 units and 20 units, so on and so forth. What, as you just explained though, if you have ordinances in place to deal with traffic mitigation, critical areas, park mitigation, school mitigation, essentially every environmental impact that a project could possibly have, why not 60 units? I mean, you're scoping the same thing for a 20-unit building as you are a 60-unit building. And I guess I would politely argue with Russ a little bit. Maybe he can explain this a little bit more, but if you have a traffic study that indicates due to building 60 units, you're providing an unsafe condition, SEPA is not the sole authority that allows you to condition that project with a correction. Through your traffic mitigation ordinance, when things go in arrears, or if there's an unsafe condition, you have the flexibility and the authority to condition that improvement. Is that not correct?
Yes, there would be other tools we could use to review a traffic impact through our concurrency ordinance, which says development has to provide safe development at an adopted level of service, whatever that service is for that intersection or corridor. That's one of the metrics we're going to look at, and the traffic study would show us that. Through the implementation of SEPA, we have another tool that we can bind that to an environmental decision versus a denial of a project. We can't require traffic impact fees for these improvements if it's above and beyond what's in our capital facilities plan. And so it becomes, what is the tool we use to get the mitigation for those additional improvements? So yes, there are other tools. SEPA is just a potentially a more definitive tool that leads to a condition versus under concurrency may lead to a denial of a project. But it's how you're framing it and what's the responsiveness of an applicant to make those improvements.
Yeah, and I guess that's the issue. It becomes the onus on the applicant to actually address that. And
Yes.
versus through the SEPA process that delays a project by a minimum of 90 days, you know, you're throwing that out there and potentially just saying that's the way it is, versus applicant go correct or address the particular problem. So I guess that kind of circles back to, how did the Planning Commission come up with 9 units and 20 units and so on and so forth? Are these numbers, is it just a comfortable number, or, you know, why not 19 units? Give me some background if you could.
Yeah, so originally staff had done a fair amount of research looking at other cities and what they had implemented that had adopted, you know, a flexible threshold for their respective cities. Staff did, after the first meeting that we had back in, I believe, in October, came back with the proposed amendments that are included in that right column to kind of run them by planning commissioners, got some additional feedback and refined them a little bit more and brought those back in December. And so it was essentially kind of an initial proposal from staff that was then refined by the Planning Commission, just based on kind of a more qualitative discussion as far as the comfort level of commissioners. So it wasn't, as far as why it's not, you know, 19 units versus 9 units on the single family. Those were units, and I would have to ask Russ on the 9 units. We had more discussion on the multifamily than on the single family, so I don't know if that had to do with the type of plat, as far as a short plat versus a traditional plat, if that was the original impetus for that.
I think that's all accurate. The staff had discussed sort of the bookends between communities like Arlington and Monroe, who have done these updates, and Everett and Marysville on the other end that went to the maximum. And so I think your description of where the comfortable middle ground, I think that is the direction that the Planning Commission went to. 9 corresponds with our current adopted thresholds for a short subdivision. So I think that one just sort of carries that over. I do think there could be still some movement in there. There are other public notification processes that follow those. The multifamily residential, I don't think there was a lot of, I know that the discussion more was they weren't comfortable with going as large as the maximums of Everett, Marysville, but they were larger than some of the other neighbors, Arlington, Monroe. So again, I do think they looked for this comfortable middle ground between these bookends that we showed them.
So, okay. So, comfort level. Okay.
Which is why we're bringing it to council also as, you know, is this your comfort level?
Okay. So, and bear with me, fellow council members, since I deal with this, I do have more questions, but David, you mentioned we need to go to the state to demonstrate that we're in compliance with environmental state regulations. Haven't we done that with our critical areas ordinance, shoreline master plan? Everything that we pass goes to the state for approval, correct?
We have. So we have done that for individual ordinances. And so as part of the WAC procedures in 197.11.800 of the Washington Administrative Code, there are specific requirements for the analysis that we need to do. We basically need to list out all of the environmental regulations that are in place in Lake Stevens and how those adequately mitigate for potential impacts of SEPA exempt development. And so it's a procedural issue. It's things that we're confident that we have the regulations in place to qualify for the flexible thresholds. We just have to officially do it and submit it to the Department of Ecology for their review. Just kind of basically
It's a perfunctory portion of this. I mean, yes, we've done this with PSRC and with Department of Commerce through our comp plan adoption for certification, but this is just Department of Ecology's own review since they're the lead agency for SEPA in the state.
So you're confident that we can address those issues, though?
Yes.
Yeah. Okay.
Yeah, so we did include an attachment in the packet today, basically listing out a table of the regulations in place, and haven't done the full analysis yet. But when you look at it, it's a pretty exhaustive list of regulations that are in place that cover basically all of the different SEPA categories as far as topic areas.
So since SEPA was originally kind of brought up back in the 70s as to address environmental impacts, if a property has no environmental impacts, which there might be one in Lake Stevens, I don't know of one, but if a property doesn't have any environmental impacts, i.e. critical areas, why does somebody have to go through SEPA?
Yeah, so I guess you're talking about specifically critical areas. I mean, for a larger project, there are other areas, obviously, things such as noise and traffic. And so those are topics that would apply even if it didn't have an impact on the lake or an impact on wetlands or streams. So that was, as Russ has mentioned, the general reason for SEPA was that there weren't a whole lot of individual ordinances or regulations in place. So as far as now, I think that's the purpose of the flexible thresholds program, is to try to identify the level of development that individual jurisdictions are comfortable with exempting from SEPA environmental reviews. So if council members believe that, a multifamily residential development of 30 units, a typical multifamily residential development of 30 units or 40 units would be that they would be comfortable with having that exempt from the SEPA review process. That's something that we can discuss, and that's kind of the main reason we brought it forth for a work session with the city council.
Okay. And then my last question would be, what other, Russ, you mentioned that SEPA is kind of the granddaddy for public involvement, or the ability for the public to comment on a project. What other avenues are there for public to comment on a 20-lot subdivision?
So under the City of Lake Stevens code, we have different permitting types, everything from a type 1 permit, which is a purely administrative, very small project, just one single family home or tenant improvement, something like that, doesn't have any other variables. Type 2 projects require just a notice of application. So that's your small to mid projects, your short subdivisions, maybe some smaller commercial projects. You get this notice of application. Hey, something's going on in your neighborhood. This is your chance to comment. To a larger subdivision that's going in front of the hearing examiner, you have the notice of application, notice of public meeting, and then a notice of public hearing. And that's your type 3 permit, your quasi judicial reviews, conditional use permits, variances. Hey, this project's going to have a little bit bigger, potentially a bigger impact on your neighborhood. And then there goes into the legislative process, the type 4s and things that go in front of the council or the hearing examiner. So there are different avenues. Small projects, usually you get 1 touch, larger projects, 2 touches, excluding SEPA. And if you do SEPA, and our goal always is to try and combine the notice of application and the SEPA decision, so they're sort of a combined point anyway to the community, so it makes more sense.
So the avenues for the public to involve are not being excluded by increasing these thresholds.
No.
Okay. Grading's an interesting one because I look at it more as truckloads versus cubic yards, but so I don't have any problem with the thresholds in regards to that. But regarding the single family and potentially multifamily, I would venture to say and support that I think the threshold should be a little bit higher. I'm not a proponent of a 30 lot unit single family residential neighborhood going in without some sort of SEPA review. Because I think you're right, Russ, it does tend to be a catch-all for some bigger impacts that may or not be that may arrive out of that. But I do think that due to all of the ordinances that we have in place that deal with traffic, parks, schools, critical areas, there's so many safeguards that are in place that weren't in place when SEPA was first adopted that I think we could have some room to increase the single family a little bit higher, maybe up to 15, maybe 20.
Okay. So what if we looked at maybe 15 units and 30 units, and then the agricultural office, et cetera, going from proposed 20, those could potentially go up to 30,000 square feet. Does that sound more in line with what you're thinking? And would love to hear from the rest of the council too.
One quick question. Is cannabis production under the agricultural designation?
It's a manufacturing.
Okay.
So the growing of it is under manufacturing?
Yeah, it's a strange definition, but yeah, it's not necessarily an agricultural definition. At least the indoor grows not.
Thank you, Council, for allowing me to ask those questions. I appreciate the time. Thank you.
Gary, I know you'll always flush all the issues out, so that's great. If we're looking at just some arbitrary numbers, I think Gary, I think you're right on with the 15 and maybe 30. I'm fine with moving them to those numbers. I do respect all the time and effort that the planning commission's put into it, but if we're just kind of picking some numbers, I think those are probably as good as the other numbers would be. So I agree with pushing it just a little bit more. So.
So, Russ, what is the definition of an agricultural structure?
I don't have that definition in front of me. I will look that up and bring that to you. So, I'm sorry, I thought you were talking about it as it relates to sort of a marijuana definition. No. Agricultural structure would be like a barn, a loafing shed, a dairy type facility that you're doing commercial level agribusiness in.
Oh, okay. Probably not something we're going to run into in Lake Stevens.
No.
All right, great. Do we have any other questions for staff?
I would bring up one last thing. This is Marcus here. As far as grading, being able to bring up the yardage there, I think that might be helpful as well.
What were you thinking about, Marcus? What adjustments?
All right, well, SEPA means time and money, and I just think if we raise a threshold for the amount of yardage that you can do for grading and so forth, that might be really helpful for a lot of plats as well.
In the grading part, I kind of worry about that one a little bit more than I do the others, because there's some places in Lake Stevens where you could do some pretty steep economic or ecological damage with moving 1,000 cubic yards around. When nobody's, and we've already had some of that done in the past when it shouldn't have been done. It wasn't 1,000 cubic yards, but it's still done. So I don't know. I'm kind of torn on that one, Marcus.
I guess I would ask him, you may be exempt from SEPA, but you're not exempt from getting a grading permit. Is that?
Well, that's true. Yeah, you're right. You're right.
It still has all the other safeguards that go along with it.
Yeah.
The grading, it just, if we move it more towards that max number, it gets
the project going faster.
Well, it means time, money, and staff resources.
Yeah, you're right. I totally understand.
Well, and as you point out, there's the other safeguards that are in place, so it's not.
Yeah.
So we can be. Yeah, that's good.
So I think the 15, the 30, and are you talking about going to 1,000 yards then, Marcus?
Whatever the max is, we feel we can go are. I mean, it still has the safeguards in place. It's just when you have to go through all this, that's just time and effort, and it hurts projects.
Right.
Can staff answer the question as to how many cubic yards triggers the permit process?
So we have 100 cubic yards takes you into a type 2 permit between, I want to say, between 50 and 100 would bring you into that administrative review. Over that goes into this type 2, which triggers a public.
Anything less than 50 cubic yards of permit is not needed, but anything 51 cubic yards or more, a permit is needed, correct? Okay, great, thanks.
All right, do we have any more questions for staff? Listen, Dave, do you have enough guidance here?
Yeah, so I think we pretty clear on the residential and the grading. We didn't touch on the parking. I don't know if there were any thoughts on that. If council members were comfortable with the 40 spaces on that, and just to clarify, that would be if you had, say, a 20,000 or 30,000 square foot commercial development, you would also be able to do up to whatever 40 parking spaces as well. And so that's goes along with the commercial exemption as well.
This is Marcus again. I would push the parking as well. I mean, it's still SEPA.
And I would tend to agree with Marcus's comments. Again, 40 spaces or even 20 spaces, you're still talking a grading permit. You're still talking impervious area as far as storm drainage, things of that sort. So there's no skating a permit process. It's just a matter of that added feature of going through SEPA.
I just do have to say, I'm not a developer, I'm not a builder, but I'm concerned about the impermeable surfaces that we would increase by growing to more parking spaces. But that's just from my side of the point. As I say, I'm not a builder, but that's my concern.
Yeah, there's no changing the permit requirements for the parking and such, as well as office, school, agriculture, whatever. It's just the added process of going through a SEPA review.
Okay, thank you.
Yes, as Councilmember Peter Shagan pointed out, they would still need to comply with our impervious surface requirements, which are obviously higher for commercial development. And then on the stormwater management would really what would be driving how much impervious surface they could have on a lot. So if they can't generate a stormwater report that supports their proposed development, they wouldn't be able to do it.
Thank you.
All the safeguards are still in place.
Gotcha.
I just want to throw in a comment. I've appreciated the conversation. It's been helpful and illuminating. I've definitely learned some things. I always feel a little bit nervous though when we ask our commissions to put their time and effort and work into coming up with recommendations. And did you say, I think you said they met 2 or 3 different times with quite a bit of information and came forward with this recommendation. Having not been a part of those conversations, having not been a part of what all went into coming up with this proposal, it feels, I take pause with just kind of jumping in and changing those numbers and not really being a part of having all the information that they had at hand to make those recommendations. I think that we have a really active and knowledgeable commission, and I trust that they took all of this information and more into consideration making these recommendations. So I feel a little, I don't feel great about jumping in and making a bunch of changes after a 30-minute conversation when they had hours of time put into making these recommendations. Just want to throw in my 2 cents. Thanks.
Councilmember Jorstad, that's exactly why I asked the question as to, what was the formulation or the process that they went through to establish those numbers. And having observed, being the liaison for the Planning Commission and so forth, it was, and I think that was confirmed by David, just a comfort level. There wasn't a qualitative or substantial definitive reason as to why 9 was selected. It could have been 11. I mean, it was just kind of, I won't say numbers pulled out of the air, but probably close to that. I mean, it's in line with our short plat regulation, I think, is probably the justification where the 9 units came from on the single family. But I don't know as though there's a lot of factual interpretation as to these numbers. I mean, it's a comfort level. So.
And yeah, from the staff side of things, I would agree with that. There were recommendations. Basically, staff had looked at examples from other cities. We had looked at different types of projects that have come through the permitting process here in Lake Stevens, just to see kind of what would have been exempt, what wouldn't have been exempt. On the high end, we looked at some projects such as the under construction apartments on Lake Drive, which are 48 units and about 42,000 square feet of building area, which seemed maybe a little bit larger than than the city would be comfortable with exempting from SEPA. But I think that the 20 units, and we can go back to Planning Commission, not go back, but basically brief them on the thoughts of the City Council and do some additional research on that. But if say the 20 units were going up to 30 units, as Councilmember Peter Shagan mentioned, I think we could ask them if they were comfortable with that as well, whether it's at a work session stage or when we move forward to the public hearings. So I think there was, some wiggle room in there, and we were trying to find the most appropriate values for Lake Stevens, and we wanted to get input from both the Planning Commission and the City Council.
Councilmember Frederick.
Yes, and I'll make my comments really quick so we can move on to the next topic. But I want to focus specifically on the agricultural threshold. The comment was kind of made in passing, but I think it's true, and we should give some consideration to it. The comment that was made was, it was, that this agricultural type of construction is something we're not likely to see here. So my question in light of that would be, why would we increase the allowance that proposed that, why would we increase the square footage, which essentially creates an incentive for a type of construction here that we don't necessarily see in the vision for the city? It seems like it would make sense to leave that in place as opposed to incentivizing the type of construction that we don't necessarily see as part of the future of the city.
Well, one of the things that I could probably answer that question on is my thought process on that would be, if we increase it, we may get a manufacturing, agricultural type manufacturing or processing plant, such as milk or cheese or, something like that, that could be up in the Hartford area, for instance, or whatever. So it might be bringing in something that we could be using as a business that's helping. But at the same time, are there a lot of those being built around in this area right now anyway? So it's kind of I don't know.
Yeah.
Well, and, even if they are being built regionally in the area, I think the question is still, does it fit with the vision that we have for the future of the city? And specifically in our retreats, we actually said, we need to take a pause and give some specific consideration to the Hartford area. What is it that we really see there? So, given that, I would almost suggest that we keep it at 10, rather than necessarily create an incentive and have a business show up that we didn't necessarily expect, that suddenly takes an area of the city in our scarce resources of buildable land, go down a different route than we necessarily expected it to go.
And under our use code, I can give you the examples of what we've determined to be agricultural. It's a little more expansive, silviculture, mining, but agricultural operation for farming would really be livestock. And we have other sections of our code that would prohibit slaughterhouses and things like that. So it's sort of a false allowed permit anyway. If we're talking about livestock, it could be livestock raising, but we don't have room in the city, nor would say if it was a smaller agricultural poultry farming, smells and other things would also be another issue for permitting a use like that. Silviculture, which is tree growing, that's permitted. Mining is permitted. That's going to go a little abroad, and then reclamation and landfills. So I think your point is well put, Councilmember Frederick, after our retreat discussion on what type of uses are we going to be looking to bring into our industrial area as it evolves.
That was my only comment. Thanks, Russ.
Well, based on that, I kind of agree with what Councilmember Frederick said, is why are we raising it at all?
Well, and Councilmember Frederick brought up an outstanding point there. I mean, we do have limited resources, and we did discuss that at a recent retreat about having a more, broader forward-thinking vision for the Hartford area. So I would, I'd support Councilmember Frederick's position on that.
Well, let us go back and incorporate your changes, have another conversation with the Planning Commission. And does council want to have another conversation on this after that before we go to public hearing? Or are you okay with the Planning Commission looking at your recommendations and massaging where we're at and then going to hearing?
I'm fine if it just goes to a public hearing afterwards. We can have the information in the packet for our review. But I think I'm comfortable moving to a public hearing based on, what happens with the Planning Commission.
I agree.
Me too.
Agreed.
Well, thank you for that. And so just to clarify, what we're discussing is 15 single-family residential units, 30 multifamily residential units, 10,000, maintaining the 10,000 square feet for agricultural, upping the office, school, commercial, manufacturing to 30,000, upping the parking to the maximum of 90 spaces, and the grading to the maximum of 1,000 cubic yards.
That's correct.
Well, thank you for the feedback. And the other minor item, as we had noted briefly, was that the Planning Commission had recommended against the adopting a separate ordinance for infill exemption. As Russ had noted, that seems a lot more appropriate for larger cities. The only city other than Seattle that we could find that for locally was the city of Everett, which had done it for their downtown area, which obviously has different land uses than the city of Lake Stevens does. So just wanted to get a final thought on that as far as if the council agrees on not moving forward with that infill exemption ordinance.
I think that's appropriate.
I do too.
All right, well, thank you very much.
Thank you, David. Appreciate it.
Thank you, David.
Great work tonight.
Good work on that, David. Good stuff.
Thank you.
Let's move on to, we're going to talk about Parks and Recreation Planning Board Code Amendment, allowing a 9-member board. Jill, you are up.
Mayor Gailey, good evening, City Council. Jill Meese, Parks Coordinator. And tonight I am bringing forward the code amendment for the expansion of the Park Board from a 7-member board to a 9-member board. With the dissolution of the Arts Commission, some of their duties have shifted to the Park Board, such as planning events and festivals. And as we look to expand the Parks Division and activate our public spaces and our parks, the increase in board members will allow the formation of some effective subcommittees to work on these expanded duties. This idea was brought forward by the interview committee after our recent interviews to fill the vacancy on the board. Each one of the candidates were uniquely qualified, and all 3 of them would be great assets to the Park Board. It would also allow a broader perspective of our community needs and respond to changing demographics, the need for economic development and updates for compliance with parks initiatives. If the City Council would like to proceed, staff can place it on their consent agenda for your next meeting. And also, if approved, all candidates would be offered the position. So with that, I'm happy to answer any questions that the council may have.
I think this is a great idea. I fully support moving in this direction.
Me as well.
As the Parks Liaison, this is a great thing. The more input, the better.
Thank you. Any other comments?
Well, I'm certainly in favor of it.
One of the other things I wanted to share with council is this really sets a primer for what staff would like to do with the park board over the next couple of months. We're going to be doing sort of an educational presentation that really hits on a lot of these points that Jill made in the second paragraph of her report, that we really want to understand, the park board to understand when the council or staff brings discussion topics to them. It's really, how are we reflecting the needs assessments we've done? How are we looking at the economic viability and rejuvenation that parks bring to the community? What tourist draws can we bring to the community? So we really want to start educating the Planning Commission, both long-term members and new members, really that their function and vision does continue to evolve as the needs of the community are evolving. So just wanted to let the council know that as we move to this format, we also have in mind a lot of education and thoughtful discussion we'd like the park board to consider as they make their recommendations back to you on the, the true scope and benefit of parks and recreations.
Thanks, Russ.
Yeah, I just want to thank Jill. Great job setting the table with that. And as Kim and Jill can probably attest, really outstanding candidates for the the Parks Board. And I'm excited to see the great work and enthusiasm and energy that they will bring to that. I will just note that one of them worked on President Obama's campaign, and he promised significant funding for our parks. Just kidding. So that was it was neat to hear him. We kind of joked with him about that. But it's neat to see how their passion and their drive dovetails pretty well with what Jill and the rest of the city's trying to do with the Parks and Recreation. So I think we got a great existing group of folks, and it's great to see how we take this to the next level.
It's very true, Council Member Ewing. They were really amazing group, and they are all very diverse though in their offerings. So we're excited to leverage that for our community. Thank you all for your comments. That's all I have.
All right, Jill, good stuff. I appreciate it. Yeah, I'm going to take a second for just a couple quick alibis. There's a couple of subjects that I want to put on the consent agenda for next Tuesday. I don't want to spend a lot of time on it because I think that they're easy answers. One is renewal of the farmers market contract with Sarah, and the addition to that contract is I think we're adding 6 TBD dates. Could be any kind of dates, kind of thing, so that we don't have to come back and ask the council every time we want to throw a new market or something up. So that will be on the consent agenda, and then as well as renewing the Skyhawks.
Skyhawks.
Well, you don't know the power I have.
Well, I want to bring the Seahawks.
Yeah, actually, we do know how the power you have. So
anyway, yeah, it's actually the Skyhawks. I appreciate downing my ego on that one. Okay, so Skyhawks, just renewing their contract as well, and as well as having a couple of TBD events within that contract as well. So we'll put both of those on the consent agenda for Tuesday, so we won't spend a lot of time on it. Okay, with that, I'll just do a round. Anybody have an alibi? Any good stuff going on that we need to know? Or
Hey, Mayor, one thing I neglected to mention last week. So the blood drive for the James Barnes second annual blood drive had 108 people that signed up for that. So they had every slot filled for that. It was a Friday, Saturday blood drive. So Efren from the Puget Sound or North Bloodworks Northwest, I guess, is a new name of their organization. But anyway, just outstanding support from our community. And Jim and Jennifer Barnes are extraordinarily grateful for the thoughtfulness of them and the community members that have provided that support for them. So thank you to everyone that played a part in that.
and thanks for your work on that too, Steve, for your organization efforts on that good stuff.
I just appreciate Public Works doing the stuff to take care of our graffiti over the weekend. We got nailed big time, and I'm glad we're on top of it. So thank you to Public Works and Eric.
Yep. Okay, any other alibis?
Mayor, did you want me to call Russell Wilson or just like check in with his people?
I got his number. We're good. I got it.
Okay.
He's going to the Saints.
Oh my
Sorry, I
goodness.
couldn't resist.
He's not going anywhere.
Well, I have him coming down, hanging out with the Skyhawks. So that's what's going on. Okay. All right. Well, with that, hey, great work, everybody. Great job over the weekend. I agree on the snow removal. Very good work. And is also kind of a testament to the community that there wasn't any major issues, and everybody did their part as our community, and it was good to see. So with that, everyone have a great evening. Go out and do some good stuff.
Good night.
Good night, guys.
Good night, everyone.
Bye.